Is Ariel Nelson. Ariel joined the League of Oregon Cities lobby team in 2019. Her issue portfolio covers housing, land use, and development. Ariel is the perfect person to address our interest in land use law and the relationship with housing availability. Prior to joining the League of Oregon Cities, Ariel led government relations and communications at Oregon Housing and Community Services. She also lobbied on a diverse range of issues for the City of Portland Office of Government Relations and served as staff in the Oregon State Senate. Ariel earned her law degree from the University of Oregon School of Law and a BA in Politics and Spanish from Willamette University. Please welcome Ariel Nelson.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me today. I put together some slides. I'm going to quickly go through kind of a background 101 of our land use system. I think many of you are probably familiar, but wanted to establish that background. And then the last few slides really get into a lot of the recent legislation, which I think will probably be more where we can kind of get into more of a discussion and Q&A. So just as a quick background, if you're not familiar, the League of Oregon Cities is a local government organization. It's actually formed from an intergovernmental agreement between all 241 incorporated cities in the state of Oregon. And so we play a pretty strong role both in advocacy and lobbying in the legislature, also in litigation. We file a lot of amicus supporting briefs for litigation involving cities, and we also provide training and education for city leaders and city officials. So, relationship of state and local land use programs. The legislature, really conveys the law through Oregon revised statutes. There are statutes. We have the executive branch, and the governor oversees the Department of Land Conservation and Development, which also has its oversight commission, LCDC. That is where we see administration of Oregon's 19 statewide land use planning goals, which often have implementation through administrative rules. And it was, the legislature that enacted the statewide land use goals in statute, but all of the work on them since then, there's been some statutory changes and also through rulemaking through executive powers. And then we have local governments, which have their own constitutional local control powers and home rule authority. They are guided by statutes, by the regulatory and administrative rules that the executive branch and the agency puts out. But local governments are the ones who are developing comprehensive plans, comprehensive land use planning plans, which then inform more specific zoning and development code. This is just a little overview of the role of LCDC and the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Another important role besides implementing the statutes and writing the administrative rules, DLC actually reviews every local comprehensive plan. They were all created in the 70s, 80s when Senate Bill 100 went into place, and since then, you don't see new plans, you see amendments to those plans. Those all get reviewed by DLCD. They can have some consideration by LCDC depending on recommendations from DLCD staff. And so they're ensuring that those plans are consistent with statewide planning goals and the administrative rules. DLCD also plays a really important role for cities in that they provide grants and technical assistance. Keeping up our land use system takes investment. The majority of cities do not have enough full-time planning staff to do all of the updates necessary to keep our plans current and relevant, and so they really rely on those grants from DLCD. So this is just one way to kind of group how we like to group our 19 statewide land use planning goals. We have people, goal 1, citizen involvement, 2, general land use planning. That is kind of the foundation for the other goals. Cities mostly play in the areas of urban planning. We're going to talk a little bit about housing because that's been such a huge focus, of course. Resource lands, you're going to more really see that in county administration. So that's not something we really play in as much for cities. And then specific areas and natural resources and environment, these are very much at play for cities. It's really going to depend on where in the state the city is located. Obviously here in Central Oregon, you're going to see probably more attention to some of the natural hazards, wildfire discussions than you would elsewhere, but obviously not talking about ocean resources or coastal shorelands in this area. This is just a representation of kind of the path or the process for comprehensive planning. citizen involvement, data collection. Comprehensive plans are informed by citizen involvement, and they are rooted in data through a variety of things like a housing needs analysis and an economic opportunity analysis. These establish goals and priorities. These help prepare the plan. It's submitted to DLCD, and then the city will implement the plan. And there's what's called a post-acknowledgement plan amendment periodic review. That's the universe that cities are working in now when they go through an amendment. That's what it's called a PAPA that DLCD and LCDC reviews. And just a little bit more about what a comprehensive plan is. Long-range policies, kind of that high-arching policy goals for a community's future development with some key issues. Includes all of that data and analysis. There's mapping, objectives and policies. Of course, have to comply with the statewide planning goals. What I just said, they update through plan amendments. And so just really briefly on the county side, counties are responsible for comprehensive planning within a county that is outside of incorporated cities and that is not federally owned. There's a lot of federally owned land in Oregon. Their major goals or purposes are preservation of agricultural and forestry land in large lots. They look at exception lands and rural residential. And there's I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but there's several categories that counties play in. There can be rural mixed use, commercial, also rural industrial. So they're working with a range of uses outside of incorporated city. They go through a similar process when they are involved in urban growth boundary expansions. If a city is looking to do that, they're in that process. They also convene with other local governments. So there's a lot of work with urban services agreements and urban planning agreements when they're working with their cities as well as with special districts. Just noting the counties, this is a statewide slides that we've used before, but counties that have large urban unincorporated areas, that's been a little bit of the focus of the state recently as we look at our housing goals. Mentioned special districts, they also have a role in our land use system. They do kind of focus comprehensive planning to meet the specific need that they serve. So if it's a fire district, fire protection, they're a wastewater district. Similarly, they often cover multi-city and county regions, and they have to make sure that their planning decisions are also consistent with the statewide land use goals. So then when we get out of, let me see, where are my slides? Okay, so when we're talking about a local land use decision, we're getting kind of outside of the comprehensive plan, but when you're actually looking at a zoning decision, you start with a land use application, it goes to the local staff review, it can go to the planning commission. Some jurisdictions don't have a planning commission, it goes to the county commission or the city council, it just depends. And if you have a planning commission, if there is an appeal, it can then go to city council or county commission. You can also appeal to the Land Use Board of Appeals. This is a unique body that we have in Oregon that is a governor-appointed 3-person board that specializes in judicial review of local land use decisions. And then they can appeal from there to the Court of Appeals all the way to the state Supreme Court. Land use timelines, you may hear about these a lot when we're talking about local land use decisions, whether it's a siting decision, zoning decision. They are subject, land use and planning review files are subject to a 120-day review timeline inside the urban growth boundary. So there's a completeness check at 30 days to make sure the application is complete. Then the city has about 60 days from there, an appeal period, and a period from there. So it's a little bit longer process outside a UGB for rural decisions and 120 inside urban. And one important thing to note is when you're looking at a development, a lot of times there's a parallel land use process and then a building codes process. And sometimes when we are hearing concerns or issues with how long decisions are taking for a development, it's important to know what's the actual land use decision. If you're looking at a decision based on like a conditional use permit or a rezone, that's land use. If you're looking for a building code, the actual characteristics of the building, that is not subject to this time period. And some cities are starting to streamline. I think Bend is one of them, is streamlining both those processes. So it may not be apparent to kind of the everyday onlooker, what is subject to this and what is else. But most cities are really working to streamline and bring those processes together on a timely manner. Just another note on appeals. To appeal, you have to have participated in the local decision at the planning commission level. That gives you standing. And then you can only raise issues that were raised in the local government proceedings. So the scope of what you can bring, if it wasn't part of the original decision and hearing, you're limited to what was in there. Just referencing again that Oregon created LUBA. They are on a fairly quick timeline as well. They decide most decisions in about 6 months, and my understanding is it's a pretty efficient process. We don't have issues with, and other court decisions can take months to years. That's not the situation with LUBA. They can affirm, remand, or reverse, kind of similar to other legal proceedings. And as I said, they can be appealed upward from there. LUBA's decision is affirmed in 90% of appeals that go up to appeals or Supreme Court. So what's happened in the last 50 years? I think many of you are familiar with Tom McCall and kind of the origins of our land use system, fighting what's called the sagebrush, some of his quotes, the sagebrush subdivision, avoiding sprawl. But we really haven't seen a major comprehensive update to the whole system. There was a conversation called the Big Look in the period between 2005 and 2009, but it didn't result in any legislation or outcomes. We've seen a lot of legislation that's reached into specific parts of the land use system to change outcomes based on contemporary needs, but we haven't seen a holistic overview. And as I mentioned before, critical to the success of our land use system is funding to support the work both at the state, at DLCD, and at the local level. Excuse me, it's allergy season. We used to do something called periodic review, which is where the state would provide funding for cities and counties to do that holistic look at their entire system. That hasn't happened for years. What we have seen in recent years, and I'll get into that in a minute, is some increases in planning grants specifically for housing. And so that's been very welcome, but it's kind of weighting the system in one way. And so we really haven't seen those holistic reviews happen. And then just to make the point again, when funding stops, the work stops. So for many cities, most don't have enough revenue to cover all of their local services. Cities are facing constrained budgets in most cases. We have measures 5 and 50 in our property tax system to thank for that. It's something the league is working on. But in the meantime, it's pretty challenging for a lot of cities to focus resources on this. So I'm going to get into recent legislation now. I joined the league right after middle housing passed. I think that's probably one of the more controversial changes or major changes to land use in Oregon. Oregon was a pioneer in this. So I joined right for the rulemaking process for that. But I think where we start to see this major focus and a lot of legislation started in 2017 was Senate Bill 1051, which said that cities have to provide for housing development clear and objective standards in their code. So really clear, and what a clear and objective standards means is that can be, approved administratively. It's not subjective, it's not something that a public body would need to weigh. It's a clear and objective path so that housing can be clearly approved. And this is not a requirement that all standards are clear and objective, but simply that there's a path that a developer can choose. And we also, from our work with development partners, sometimes there are developments that need a more flexible, less clear and objective path, and so that's always an option for developers as well. I mentioned 2019, this was the major legislation which basically removed exclusive single-family zoning and legalized middle housing types, everything from duplexes up to triplex, quadplex, cottage clusters, townhomes in every area in a city. But note that those requirements for cities with populations of 10,000 and above, all of them have to legalize duplexes, and then cities 25,000 above was the other middle housing types as well. The other bill that passed that session that gets a lot less attention, but was the precursor for a lot of the work that's happening right now, are housing production strategies. And this is a requirement that it puts cities at 10,000 population above on a regular schedule to do their housing needs analysis. Like I said, due to lack of funding, whether a city had an updated housing needs analysis was really dependent on their resources. Excuse me. And this puts every city on a every 6 years for metro, and every 8 years for cities around the state to do a housing needs analysis. That also comes with funding from TLCD to support that work. Excuse me. And then the most important part is within a year of adopting that housing needs analysis, the city now has to do what's called a housing production strategy. And this is less in the technical land use code and more about what are cities doing to encourage housing. It kind of shifted the paradigm of taking local governments out of a kind of a neutral, passive regulatory role of actually going out and figuring what are the policy levers, what are the investments that they can bring to actually encourage development of housing. And so cities have been starting to do that. I think the rules went into place in 2020, 2021, and so we've seen a number of housing production strategies. You can see them on DLC's website go into place. And I'll get more into that when I talk about what happened in the last couple of years. In 2021, we were in the pandemic. This was largely a virtual session, but we started to see a lot of bills happen, what we kind of call super siting. This is where it takes a land use decision out of the normal land use process that we just talked about and gives them just a very clear path with very clear parameters, and, specifically around shelter and affordable housing needs that often see a lot of community opposition. So emergency shelter siting. If you meet certain parameters for a shelter, a city must approve it. Thank you so much. Affordable housing siting and zoning, Senate Bill 8. This was a bill that says the affordable housing will be approved if it meets regular land use other standards in any commercial, any publicly owned land, any church-owned land, and light industrial. City will approve it without going through a rezone process or a conditional use permit. And what that effectively does is it takes it out of the public goal one citizen engagement process, and it's more of an administrative decision. And this was to clear the way for more affordable development and reduce opportunities for litigation to stall affordable development. We saw similar authorities for citing childcare facilities, for converting motels to shelter, like if you're familiar with Project Turnkey. This was an effort that the League supported with some really important funding from the state to acquire motels and hotels and convert them into transitional housing and shelter. We also worked on a bill that kind of took a next step with the middle housing legislation and created kind of a clear expedited process, not just to be able to site middle housing and build middle housing, but to clearly divide land. If you're buying a piece of land and you want to build duplex, quadplex, to clearly divide it for home ownership purposes and have two separate owned lots. In 2022, we saw some more super siting, this time for manufactured and modular housing, recognizing that manufactured housing is a naturally occurring form of affordable housing and modular as well. And another major thing that took place in 2022 is the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Rulemaking, CFEC. That is one that impacts Bend, it doesn't impact every city. But this came out of, in 2020, you may be aware, the 2020 legislature, there was a Republican-led walkout, and that session actually did not complete. It ended, they gabbled out without passing a lot of legislation. And so because of that, and the walkout was mostly around legislation related to cap and trade and climate response. So as a result, Governor Brown issued an executive order essentially directing the state agencies to use everything within their statutory power to rulemaking and achieve some of the same goals that were intended in the legislation that didn't make it through. And so that's where we get the Climate Friendly and Equitable Communities Rulemaking, CFEC, which are very, very comprehensive changes to both housing planning and transportation planning with the goal of reducing vehicle miles traveled and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Representing the cities for this, it was a very difficult rulemaking process. It was all remote, on Zoom. It was very rushed. The department was not giving the resources that they usually have to support productive rulemaking. They usually have resources for extra staff to do analysis, for trained facilitators to manage productive conversations. That did not happen in this rulemaking. And we saw some very prescriptive rules that were difficult and are very difficult for cities to administer. And also they're very expensive and they're currently not funded. So you may have heard that there's a coalition of cities and counties that are challenging the rules, not because we don't agree with the goals, but because the way that they were enacted. But the general sense is that cities that are subject to CFEC, Bend being one, is that you're going to be establishing climate-friendly areas, which are meant to be more walkable, bikeable, pedestrian-friendly, mixed-use areas. I think that's a direction most cities were already going, and it just gives more specifics around doing that. And then there's some very specific transportation planning requirements. The transportation system plan is how communities plan for transportation in and around their other goals. And there's some specific updates related to that, and that is really the most expensive piece there. It also requires very intentional outreach community engagement with a stronger equity lens. We don't currently have specific administrative rules for Goal 1, and community outreach needs to be updated. And I think we're seeing more specific guidance come through CFEC and come through the ONA, which I'll talk about in just a second. So in 2023, our last long session, a new House Bill 2001 was passed, and just if you are a nerd like me and want to know why, the significance, the early 2000s numbers are the numbers reserved for the Speaker of the House, and so that signifies priority of a bill. And on the Senate, it's like Senate Bill 1, 2, 3. So Senate Bill 8 in 2021 was a Senate President's priority. Senate Bill or House Bill 2001 has been a different speaker this time, but a speaker's priority. And the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis really takes the next step from that bill in 2019 on those housing production strategies, and it does and we're in the rulemaking process right now at DLCD. There's a lot of information online. You can watch the racks on YouTube if you want the details, but it's basically doing a massive update to Goal 10, which is our housing goal. And it's creating an accountability and audit process for cities who are doing that housing production strategy, and it's going to be giving targets, actual numbers of housing units that cities are going to be directed to meet, and having their housing production strategy as the tool to do so. So we're having some pretty involved conversations right now about what are things that are within a city's control contributing to housing production or that are barriers, and what are things that are outside a city's control, what level of enforcement is appropriate. In lieu of enforcement, many times a lot of these barriers are due to lack of resources and funding, so what is the state's role in that? So that's all going on right now. The other bills that we saw some kind of similar to supersiding, some language around commercial conversions, basically making it easier for if you have a commercial building that you want to convert to housing, it wouldn't have to go through that land use process again. It would just be the building code process. This is a kind of a national trend looking at adaptive reuse rather than expansion. I think from our understanding, a lot of these buildings aren't suitable for building code reasons for permanent residences, and many of them just need to be torn down. So the utility of this land use, I'm not sure that we're going to see it used much because the cost of actually converting those buildings to residential is quite high, but it's a tool in the tool basket. There was a housing omnibus bill. This is a trend we're seeing in the legislature where they pack 5 to 10 policy changes in one bill. So included in there that are changes are residential use of commercial lands. This is similar to the conversions, but just kind of a lot of cities were already doing mixed use development. This requires them to allow residential development in commercial zones. That can raise some conflicts with the overall land use system we can talk about. It also legalized single room occupancy siting, also known as SROs. These are more affordable housing types where you have private bedroom units and shared potential kitchen or restrooms. So there were potentially some local codes that did not allow these types of buildings. Now they're required. So that was on the housing omnibus bill. There's a bunch of other stuff in there too, but I'm just talking to the ones that were specific to cities. Manufactured housing zoning just took another step and basically added manufactured and modular housing to that Senate Bill 8 zoning. So anywhere that you're required to allow affordable housing, that's in commercial and light industrial zones, similarly for manufactured and modular types of housing. There was a big CHIPS package based on the federal investments coming for CHIPS manufacturing, and in Senate Bill 4, and a piece of that gives the governor the authority to bypass the land use system and make some UGB expansions, specifically in response to investment opportunity from manufacturers. She has not yet exercised that authority, and I should have the date in front of me, but I think it expires in the next year, so it's a very limited window. And then I put it in here, it wasn't one that the league engaged in on the land use side, although our energy and environment lobbyist was tracking it. There is rulemaking ongoing right now for House Bill 3409 for Eastern Oregon solar siting, and it's basically all of Central Oregon East is how that's defined in statute, and the bill that passed, it was part of a larger environmental package, but it directs DLCD to create some rules, because I don't think there were specifics or parameters around how to site solar and to consider it part of rural industrial uses and how to manage the conflicts or benefits of solar siting with the other land use goals. So that may be one you want to check out as well. Then we get to 2024, which was a short session and usually not when we see a lot of legislation, but I'll just quickly take through what happened. House Bill 4063 was a number of technical fixes because many of the bills that passed in 2023, including the ONET, they wanted to pass them so fast that we did not get to have the detailed technical land use discussions, and so we caught some things that needed clarifying. There was a number of different things in there. A bill we're very excited about at the League, Senate Bill 1564, directs DLCD to create model housing ordinances that cities can then just adopt by reference. So they don't have to go through a whole public process and develop it themselves. If there's an ordinance, a model code that makes sense for their community, whether it's for a middle housing type that they weren't required to do and haven't done yet, for modular, for other things, they can just use the DLCD and they can kind of plug and play which pieces they want to use or all of it. And it's just a quicker path. It reduces the burden. It basically keeps them from having to wait until they get grant funding to hire a special planner to do that. They can use the state's resources. UGB expansion referrals. This bill passed and was somewhat in response to a situation playing out in the city of North Plains in Western Washington County right now, where a local UGB expansion decision, someone filed to refer it to the ballot. And the league supported this bill, not getting specifics of North Plains, but in recognition that the UGB expansion process and our land use system is already quite long, with multiple opportunities for appeal, and we don't believe that it was ever intended that these kinds of decisions would go to the ballot. So this just says those are not referable, and it kind of refers back to the land use system. This is how you appeal these kinds of decisions. Two bills we were very excited about: infrastructure for housing. So we can talk about barriers and opportunities for housing development, and we've got cities across the state, large, small, are all experiencing this housing crisis. I think the barriers and the opportunities look slightly different depending on your market, your geography, your existing development history and built environment. But the number one thing that also, and I should also say on urban growth boundaries expansions, which we can get into, very controversial, very critical for those cities who truly are land constrained and are growing rapidly. I think the city of Bend is one of those. Some cities, when they drew the UGBs in the 70s, they've still got tons of land and they did not grow potentially as expected. So for the cities who aren't land constrained, it's really not an issue for them. So the league kind of, it's not our top priority because it's not an all city thing. The one issue that is a top priority for all cities is infrastructure, and it is the number one barrier to developing housing, both near term and long term. So we're talking, streets, bridges, but water hookups, sewer, stormwater, drinking water. And so we were really thrilled to see some momentum and recognition from the legislature on that this session. The governor was really pushing for programmatic resources. So, putting a bucket of money at Business Oregon where the infrastructure resources have typically been administered with some specific focuses on housing. So not just infrastructure for infrastructure's sake and updating systems, which is also desperately needed, but specifically more site-specific or slightly larger infrastructure investments, like think a pump station or a connecting road that's really going to unlock the development. And the legislature in a short session did not want to stand up new investments, new programs. They wanted money out the door quickly. And so in this case, the legislature went out and we saw direct allocations in these two bills, mostly to cities, a few special districts, a few housing developers for those site-specific infrastructure costs. And we're actually going to be celebrating with the governor next week at a bill signing ceremony, and are looking forward to, that's probably going to be our top priority going into the next session, is continuing that momentum for more infrastructure investment, programmatic or otherwise. And then the other bill, of course, was Governor Kotek's housing production package. That was Senate Bill 1537. You may know if you track these things, this was a continuation of her bill from 2023 that did not pass. We were deeply involved in a lot of negotiations around this bill. I think we were neutral on the bill coming into this session, so most of our major concerns had been addressed. However, we still have a lot of cities who are pretty concerned about some of the pieces in here. It does a couple major things. It establishes what's called the Housing Accountability and Production Office, which the state calls the HAPO, which is standing up a new, and it's gonna have like 20 staff in it, a new process where anyone can file a complaint. It can be related to a comprehensive plan, it can be related to a specific development if the city's decision does not, and this is just for decisions within the UGB, so city decisions, complaints that a decision violates state housing law. So this could be saying, hey, the city's, quote, clear and objective standards, we don't think they actually are, and no one's had the opportunity to litigate this, we want it to go to this office. It could be a developer saying, the city is making me change my development application for this housing, and I don't agree with them, I think it violates the law. I don't think what they're doing is appropriate or legal. They can file that complaint. Cities can also proactively come to the office and say, hey, we know that our code needs work, we haven't had the ability to do this, can you help us out? We want to bring it up to standards. Because again, we've got decades of unfunded work, and so cities have not been able to keep up. And then particularly in the last few years, all of the legislation that you saw, other than the middle housing, none of it actually explicitly directs cities to update their code, and the reason it didn't do that is because the state would have then had to pay for that. So they just say, oh, we're gonna change it in statute, and if someone comes in and wants this, you can't say no, but we're not gonna tell you you have to update your code. Well, the appropriate thing to do and the effective thing to do is to update the code, and we've got cities who've been able to do that and cities who haven't. And there also hasn't really been any guidance on how to do it the right way, how to do it the best way, what are the best practices. So I've got a worst case scenario for this HAPO and a best case. And so the folks with the really strong fears that this is gonna be another layer of bureaucracy to slow down housing approvals. We're gonna have cities who are, over the years, we've got a lot of new great staff at DLCD. Many of them are straight out of grad school without a lot of applied on the ground practical experience. And so I think we've got experienced city planners who are concerned they're gonna be having to defend, reasonable things to unexperienced staff. We also are concerned it can be an avenue for NIMBYs, for folks who don't want housing approved, and they're gonna complain about that. On the best case scenario, it's gonna provide these resources. It's gonna give the state an ability to have a more comprehensive look at what's happening in local codes, and to kind of zoom in where help is needed. The other thing that we see happen quite often, and it affects my job as a lobbyist all the time, is someone will bring a bill to the legislature based on one specific development in one city that is by no means a systemic problem. It's kind of a one-off wonky thing that may or may not have happened for good or bad reasons, and they want to change statewide statute for that. My hope is that the HAPO will cut down on that, and that they'll be able to say, look, this complaint you brought over here, this is, developments are tricky, they're unpredictable. You get new information sometimes when you get into the site. It's not always the city's fault. So, if it's a strong program, my hope is that it'll kind of cut down on some of that. There's also some reporting requirements. We're hoping it'll be a good source of data, but all of that is TBD. The HAPO does not actually turn on the lights until July of 2025, so they've got quite a long implementation ramp up ahead. The other major piece that was the biggest concern for cities in this governor's bill was mandatory adjustments. Cities are now required to approve up to 10 adjustments for siting and design standards. So these are things like how much of the building is required to be dedicated to windows, what are the facade materials, what's an appropriate setback from the property line, there's a lot of requirements in code about like active facades of buildings in terms of not having just like blank walls on the ground floor of a mixed use area. Cities now have to, if a developer comes in and says, I want to pass on this, and this, the city has to approve it. It's an administrative decision, there's no public hearing, it's just done. We negotiated to a more specific list of what they can request adjustments from. For example, when the bill was introduced, cities would not be able to enforce a tree code and to preserve trees. That was a major concern for cities. We had safety concerns about being able to regulate where driveways are placed and where traffic is coming in and out, all of these kinds of things, and it was a really tough fight. So it'll be interesting to see how that gets implemented. Another piece, limited land use decisions. These are another way of describing those more administrative decisions that are a counter-staff decision. It's a yes or no, did you meet this requirement? Versus going to a public process. This adds in some more specific types of land use decisions. Some of them are like partitions, things like that, that are now limited land use decisions. There's a land use opt-in, which basically clarifies what most cities understand to be the law, which is if you're a development applicant and you apply for a development, and in the middle of your process, the law changes. Either the city updates their code or the state law changes. You can now say, hey, actually, I want to come in through this new law. You shouldn't have to start from scratch and pay a bunch more fees. We completely agree with that, so we passed that. Cities can still recoup expenses if it's, majorly changes the law. We're not going to allow applicants to pick and choose between old regulations and new. It's either you're going in through the old or you're taking the new. Clarifies that. And that, those were the major, oh yes, of course, the one-time UGB tool. This got the most coverage, was really the bulk of the discussion in 2024. And it was one that the league was, relatively supportive of, but again, not a major priority for all of our members. But this now creates a tool where if you're a city who has housing need, you can do an expansion. It can only be on non-resource land or a designated urban reserve. That's not that many cities, that's not that many cases. We only have, I think, 13 designated urban reserves, only a few outside the metro area, and then non-resource land. There's not a lot of county land on there that's designated non-resource, meaning like not protected farmer forest, high value farmer forest. So not a lot of cities can do this. The ones that do, from there, if you do have that kind of land, it has to meet need and affordability. So if you have done a UGB expansion in the last 20 years, it has to be like very close to fully developed, or the city's done all the infrastructure planning and everything it can for someone to come in and develop it. You also have to meet your percentage of your residents who are severely rent burdened, meaning they pay 50% or more of their income on housing cost expenses. That percentage has to be higher than the state percentage. And so there's, depending on your city, there's a lot of folks that don't qualify under that. And that one's gonna change based on the census data every couple of years. I will say the two cities who are the most vocally supportive of this piece were the city of Hillsborough and the city of Bend. And not to speak for the city of Bend, I don't represent them, but my understanding working closely with them is that Bend is rapidly growing, has available land. And one of the things that comes into play, and I'm not gonna get into specifics, but you should ask your local folks, is we've got, when we talked about the role of cities and counties with urban growth boundary expansion, you've got counties doing zoning on the rural land outside the UGB. And so I think there's a dynamic of that land being zoned for less dense rural residential, and it's when you do expand your UGB, it's a lot harder to bring that in for the type of climate-friendly developments that we're trying to do. And so I know the city's trying to get ahead of that and also just trying to think ahead. So they're not sure, they have to check the census data. But the other challenge for the city of Bend, which you may be aware, is Bend is growing so fast, the census data is already outdated when it's published. It does not actually represent the growth and the affordability levels. And the affordability metric is challenging for Bend because as it's growing so fast, lower income folks are getting displaced. So it doesn't mean that housing cost burden, that renter burden data doesn't actually really accurately portray the situation in Bend, because you're trying to retain more low income folks, but if they're getting pushed out, that disqualifies them from the need category. So it's a challenging place to be in and one that they're working through. So that'll happen the last few years. So all cities are in just very deep implementation mode. They implemented middle housing, they went straight into climate friendly and equitable communities, all of the statutory changes, I mentioned all the bills that passed. So CFEC, they've been doing those housing production strategies. Now they're gonna be looking to how they're gonna do the mandatory adjustments, how they work that into their code so it's clear, both to developers and the public, what's allowed, what's not allowed. Those limited land use decisions changed that I mentioned, the land use opt-in, making sure their code is clear, they're less their code and probably more their application process is just clear. So that's all happening. And then DLCD is doing an enormous amount of rulemaking right now. I joke that I spend every day with them. They're rulemaking on the ONA. They are doing rulemaking on Goal 9 target industries. So Goal 9 is economic opportunity and jobs. And so if cities are similar to doing a housing need analysis, they do an economic opportunity analysis, which looks at trends, the looks at kind of what industries they've seen or what they think might be coming. And because so much of this is dependent on technology, it's a 20-year planning process like we do for the whole system. It's pretty difficult, and so this is talking about defining target industries and what you're basing your EOA on. So that conversation's ongoing. I was just in a meeting this morning. They're updating Goal 5, which is cultural and natural resources. This is specifically around cultural areas, resources, and specifically around tribal resources. So this is a really great update. My only concern is that they've got some good cities and counties on the rack, but we need to make sure the whole state knows about it. This is really about working more closely with tribes and understanding the process to make sure that as you grow and as you develop, you're considering tribal resources appropriately. There's a whole rulemaking going on around farm and forest conservation program improvements. I mentioned the Eastern Oregon solar siting. There's also a child care siting work group to look at what barriers still remain to approving child care facilities, both in land use and in building code, and others. They're going to be implementing that housing accountability and production office, the mandatory adjustments, and they all are also going to be putting out guidance and information around the one-time UGB tool. So that is a lot. I don't have a clock up here, so I have no idea how much time we have left.
It's about 20 till. There's
Okay,
one on the back
perfect.
wall.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so we've got plenty of time, hopefully. Yep, that's it. And I can go back if you want to see a slide, but just wanted to kind of give you the landscape of all of the things that have been happening, and happy to talk about what you think is coming or what could come. So I see. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you. This was a very comprehensive presentation about land use planning in Oregon. My question is kind of at a very high level. Regarding the League of Oregon Cities, could you clarify for me, is it a government organization, a quasi-government organization, a nonprofit organization? Is its primary purpose lobbying? If so, who do you represent in that lobbying effort? Where does your budget come from? In other words, who are you?
Absolutely. So yes, I think we're either quasi or government organization. We are an extension of cities. The question was, what is LOC? We are fully supported by city dues. So all cities pay dues to be a member. All of our incorporated cities are members. They're of course scaled to city population and resources. Our primary roles are advocacy, lobbying, and education. So we do a lot of, we put out elected essentials every year that we have folks take office so they understand public records, ethics, public meetings rules, those kinds of bare bones, basics to how to run a city council meeting, what your role is, budgeting. We do more issue-specific stuff. A lot of our education and outreach is how to access federal resources that are coming, working with the state agencies to get information to our members, all of that. We only represent cities. We partner with a lot of other organizations, but it's cities are really the kind of government practitioners, and I'll be frank, it's kind of sometimes a difficult client because we're kind of boring. Like we just want things to work, and and so we are a lot of times, especially in the land use realm, I'm coming in with really technical feedback, like, hey, don't have a problem with your intent here, but the way you're writing this is going to be really confusing for planners to know what the intent was and how to do this. So that's a lot of the space that I work in. We are completely nonpartisan, so not involved in any campaign activities at all. All the regular public employee rules apply to me, so I don't get involved in any of that in my professional realm. What else? And the other thing to know is that, because we are an association, we represent all 241 cities, not all cities have the same position on things. And so if we've got something that's really important for, the Portland metro area cities, and Eastern Oregon says, we don't like this at all, we'll stay out of it. We'll say, hey cities, you go forth and represent yourselves. So that's another consideration. Our legislative agenda is member-led, where we have a policy committee process that's city staff and city electeds that come together and consider the priorities. Goes out to their full membership. Every city has a vote and ranks the priorities, and that really informs our agenda. So it's things like, infrastructure funding. Do you have a follow-up?
How many people do you have in your organization? You referred to a 3-board member of LUBA. Who are those 3 individuals?
Okay, so the league itself is an office. We have 19 employees. We have a 6-person lobby team that I'm a part of. We have a member services and education team. We also put on conferences for our members and the public. We're going to be here in October for our annual conference and event, if you're welcome to come. A lot of really interesting programming. We've got, you know, a two-person comms shop. We've got our budget and our books. So that's who we are. And then, you know, in terms of the organization, anyone who is a city elected or a city staff, their city's a member, they are a member of LOC.
Luba?
Luba is, you want to know who they are. So there's three appointed. They're land use attorneys. They're experienced. I don't have in front of me what their term, you know, the length of time that they serve. They are governor appointed, and they're an independent, you know, legal court authority designated. I know one of them because I went to high school with her, but I don't remember their names other than that. Sorry, I don't have. Does that get at it? Okay. Yes.
It's been difficult to link water availability with development. Is there some reason why that can't be part of the land use planning process?
That's a great question. So one of the things we see from our vantage point as cities a lot is silo kind of divisions between state agencies. And one of the ones we're seeing right now is the Oregon Water Resources Department is working on rulemaking and around long-term water planning and basins. And I'm not the water lobbyist, but I've been kind of tracking this because they're looking at putting some pretty strict restrictions on expanding water rights and water usage for, you know, conservation purposes. Unfortunately, I'm not sure where it's at now, but their initial approach was just a statewide metric, and I think we were just advocating to have a place-based approach, basin-specific, because of just, and I know it's a really deep issue here in Central Oregon, and so there also did not appear, there seems to be a disconnect. You know, the water resources, their mission is water management, right? That makes all the sense, but it didn't seem like anyone was connecting the dots between how this impacts cities and the requirements we're getting to produce more housing and to grow. And so, you know, cities are used to balancing these things. That's the role of government, and the state it's been really difficult to partner with the state in those conversations.
Have the cities not been able to say, we don't have the water, we aren't gonna grow?
I mean, I think we're gonna see that come to bear when we start to implement the ONA and the housing production strategies, and cities are gonna be measured and say, okay, you did this plan, we wanted you to build X amount of units. And it's not just X amount of units, it's X amount of units at various affordability levels. And the city's gonna say, well, you know, it's gonna be a conversation with the state, why didn't we see this? We think that, you know, every city's gonna have a deficit at this point, based on our history as a state of underproduction. It's gonna be several cycles before we actually see measurable, you know, we're gonna see success, but like what is success and how much can you go? And there are gonna be barriers that cities run up against, potentially water restrictions, and that's gonna be part of the conversation. But that's the conversation we're having in the rules right now is, let's not, quote, punish cities or, you know, for things that are out of their control, like water supply. Yes.
Do we have the mapping to show statewide where we do actually have more water resources available? And are there ways to incentivize growth in those areas? Because we know that population is decreasing in Oregon overall, but it's really increasing in Central Oregon.
Yeah, I know we have some mapping. I don't know how comprehensive it is, but that would be a great question for water resources and for DLCD to kind of see where those overlap. In the back, right there.
Did you say there are no rules for community outreach?
So goal one, are there no rules for community outreach yet? Goal one is titled citizen engagement, which needs an update in and of itself because cities support a lot of residents who aren't necessarily citizens. And yeah, there's just the statutory language. There's never been any administrative rulemaking to actually have some kind of clear, like, this is how you do effective, equitable outreach. All cities are required to have a goal one plan and community engagement plan. That's typically the foundation for any land use decisions. And you know, these comprehensive plans require community outreach. So that goal one plan is in every city. You should be able to look it up. Many of them have not been outdated or updated, however, you know, as we learn more about, you know, best practices and racial justice and community engagement techniques, and as we, you know, the other things that are in statute is like providing notices in the newspapers, and we know that's changing. It doesn't reflect the internet, it doesn't reflect electronic communications and how people receive information and how they engage, and so that is one of the arguments for the update. Those conversations have happened before. I know we've got a number of cities who are asking for it. Unfortunately, it's incredibly expensive undertaking for the state. In statute, to do Goal 1, they have to go out around the state and talk to everyone, as they should. And it just hasn't apparently risen to the attention or the priority level of the governor's office in terms of, moving forward on housing pieces specifically. At the same time, the ONA implementation, the rulemaking, is building in some very explicit, very cutting edge outreach requirements around housing. We also saw that in the CFEC rules. So doesn't mean that cities aren't doing anything. And we also have a number of cities who are leading and really great best practices on the ground and ways that they're finding new ways to engage with community members and get information out. So it doesn't mean that nothing's happening, but yeah, I think LOC agrees that conversation is due. It's just the other thing that we're balancing is cities have so much on their plate right now that it wouldn't be possible for them to participate effectively in a Goal 1 update in the next couple of years. It would have to be a ways out, or they'd have to stop some of the other work. All right, in the green jacket.
Hi, so my question, I'm gonna ask my question and then explain why I'm asking it. So my question is there a process that LOC provides to the cities as to how to disseminate the information on the legislation that's under consideration? The reason I'm asking that is, as a city councilor, I have received a list of LOCs considering legislation, but the timeline is not enough timeline for council to discuss or staff to interface with us to come to a city decision. And so I'm not sure how the city is communicating back.
Great, so I'm not sure if you're talking about legislative decisions that pass or in terms of LOC's legislative agenda.
LOC's legislative, the things that they're looking at, and they've got a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or they're not taking a position.
So our ballot of potential priorities goes out to members. It'll go out, I think, end of June this year, and it's typically out for cities for a couple of months because there are a lot of cities, especially smaller cities, that don't meet every month as a council. And that always goes to a city council for that determination of what you're going to support. And then we just take the rank and we develop the agenda around that. It will probably be adopted or formalized by the board in, I think, October, November this year. At the same time, most, especially the larger cities, not every city, but a lot of cities will adopt their own individual legislative agenda just as their own, their priorities. And for some cities, it's, two things or one thing. We're going to go in and try and get money for a water project or something, go through the capital construction process. For other cities, it's a wide-ranging, complex agenda. LOC's agenda also, when you asked the earlier question about what we do and who we lobby for, we really stick to city things. So other issues that are, say there are plenty of city councilors who are big education champions or other issue areas but cities don't actually, implement education or typically have much of a role. And so we don't focus on those issues. We really stick to kind of nuts and bolts where cities play a role. There are situations where we will support something. For example, the committee that I staff, which is Community and Economic Development, they're really interested in helping remove barriers and providing incentives for childcare to make more childcare happen. So that would be a support position for the league. It wouldn't be a bill that we bring. We would be working with education, early education partners and other folks to kind of support something going forward. So in terms of the timing, it really doesn't limit what any one city does. We also don't tell any one city what to do. We're not we don't have that authority. We're really just, our goal is to help cities speak with a stronger voice in the legislature and also in DC with our federal delegation, really lifting up those top line issues for state and federal decision makers, like infrastructure funding, various things. Go ahead.
A follow-up question. So the example is not my city, but a city. The information comes to the mayor. The mayor does not share the information. The mayor responds back to LOC. So the guidance I was hoping LOC would provide is you need to share this information.
Sure, yeah, I can check back. I think that's always been how we've communicated it, but again, it's not something, I can check and see how that gets sent out, if it can be more broadly distributed, but we do defer to each city the process they want to engage with the ballot.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah, and you've had your hand up, Blue
Yeah,
Shirt.
I'm just wondering if you could expound on one thing or expand on the issue of the water availability for development. If we were trying to get that through, where would be the place that it would rest? Would it be having to have goal 20, or would it be somewhere else? Where would you put it in the hierarchy of things that, I don't think, it probably doesn't just belong with OWRD, but it belongs to
No.
land use planning as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think in the natural resources area, I think that there's air, water, and land resources quality. I think there is space within the existing goals. I think what we, from the league's perspective, we're looking for is just much stronger communication and coordination between the two agencies. Because so much of what DLC does, it's the long-term planning, and there are other agencies who do the actual implementation. Although the water planning at OWRD is definitely more related in that area. So we're seeing this kind of breakdown across different spaces. I talked about the goal line, economic development rulemaking, and Business Oregon is kind of not really there, and so wanting to more strongly align those programs. So in terms of where you advocate for that, certainly through the city is one way to do it, but I think as your league, you have the ability to reach out through your local legislators. You might also consider, the governor's office has regional solutions coordinators. You have a regional solutions coordinator for Central Oregon, and their role is really to be kind of on the ground helping communities with kind of cutting through red tape and accessing state agencies, so that might be someone to reach out to as well.
Thank you.
You bet. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I've heard a number of people talk about the housing situation, especially low-cost housing, here in Deschutes County. And I have not heard anybody even bring up the subject of the relationship between low-cost housing and transportation. So for example, perhaps Lapine should be changing their permitting processes to allow for more apartment buildings or whatever to get low-cost housing down there, if we had a good transportation system between Lapine and Bend for the people that have to commute and work here. Isn't that part of the solution, or should that not be part of the solution, as opposed to increasing the urban growth boundary around Bend?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely is part of the conversation, and that's really what the ONA is getting at. It's not just, are you permitting housing, but what types, like what affordabilities can those serve? And transportation is key. It's also it's a tough one for cities, because most cities it's a transportation district, and the funding for that and where it goes is not necessarily within the city's ability to dictate, as much as some would like to be able to more closely align those with housing. And so that's another one where we've got cross-agency coordination that needs help. Yes.
I really appreciate your presentation. What does ONA stand for?
Sure, sorry about that. I try not to go into acronyms too much. It's Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. And so that was what was passed in House Bill 2001 in 2023. And that really is the comprehensive update to Goal 10, looking at a new definition of what needed housing is, looking at different, and it's needed housing right now is defined as housing that's affordable for area median income at 120% of our area median income or less. So that reflects, when we think about affordable housing and like publicly subsidized housing, that's typically 60% and below for rental units. When we're looking at more affordable, permanent affordable home ownership, so things like Habitat for Humanity and land trust models, that goes from 80, 100, 120% depending on your market. But we also are, the state is paying more attention to middle income, so not publicly supported, but housing we're not seeing built by the market right now, which can go up to 120, 130% of area median income. And one of the pieces that was implemented, that's not a requirement for cities, but a tool that we are excited about, I could have mentioned, it was included in the governor's package, 1537, is an investment in a revolving loan fund. It's eligible for all housing affordability up to 100, it's either 120 or 130%. I went back and forth, but it's shallow subsidy. It's a program that cities can bring on that will be supported by the state. It's a revolving loan fund, so there's seed money in it, and essentially it would be a city would have to opt into it. This is not going to work for every city due to all of the property tax issues, but they would have, for new housing, the housing would pay a fee in lieu of property tax. So it would take the value of the land, and that would still go into the regular property tax system. But the improvement of whatever housing gets built on top of that for 10 years would go back to feed this fund. And so they would pay the city back over 10 years, and the city would pay the state loan fund back to continue to put this out. And cities could tailor the program such that they're saying, we're only gonna use this to support this bracket of income housing that we don't have resources for over here, or we're gonna do it in this area of town that we wanna focus development on. And it's gonna be a shallow subsidy for that housing that's gonna be able to get at costs of system development charges and infrastructure, things that we don't have resources for right now, that's gonna make that development more affordable and happen faster or at all. And the housing would be required to maintain that affordability for the 10 years. Yep. Yes.
You have a tremendous amount of knowledge, and there are a lot of cities, but can you tell us just off, if you know, the three main, land use problems that Deschutes County Bend is facing in your league, what you are dealing with us?
I can take a stab, but I'm not an expert. You would really want to talk to the folks here. I think I mentioned the rapid growth. I think I mentioned displacement. I think the water availability and long-term water availability is a major issue. And I think the other thing to watch that I didn't get into as much is the wildfire planning and resiliency stuff that's happening and the funding for that. So I think that's going to be a major overlay for this area as well, and how that impacts development, where it happens, what the building requirements are that can raise the cost of those houses, right, to make them more fire safe, things like that. Go ahead.
You bring up that point, and when I was looking at your yellow specific areas, it does not include 2/3 of the state. It's very specific to the Willamette Valley and to the coast and estuary, which is mostly coastal or coming in through the Willamette Valley. And we've had a lot of very severe wildfires, and we will continue to experience that as a threat. How should we push to make that a priority within this planning goal system?
Yeah, I would say, even though it's not reflected in the text here, it is a statewide priority, and it is happening. It's, again, really challenging for cities and for Oregonians to track all of these pieces. And I wasn't around for the creation professionally of the land use system, but I think a lot of these are reflecting some federal environmental protections as well, that we don't see similar for this part of the state.
So EPA based.
Right, and kind of coastal stuff. So, sorry, you want to check with probably someone at the city or the county that does land use to get a better answer on that one. Go ahead.
I have kind of a complicated question, because it involves both county and city, and it has to do with the specific definition of shelter and safe parking. Have you been involved in the discussions about refining those definitions so that some of the state money can go where, some of us think it should be going? I was at county commission meeting yesterday when this came up.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely very involved in those conversations. I don't know that there's a specific conversation about changing the definitions, but there are a number of cities who are a little frustrated with there's currently a lack of information right now from Oregon Housing Community Services, where I used to work, in terms of what the plans are for future shelter funding and what's eligible and what is the state paying for and what it's not. Traditionally, Oregon really has not had a shelter system. The state really didn't play much of a role. The majority of the resources, I'll step back. There's very scarce resources, obviously, right? We've seen a big increase in investment in the last few years. Traditionally, HUD has provided funding through continuums of care. You have a Central Oregon Continuum of Care here that was kind of loosely held by kind of a nonprofit organization, has now moved to COIC. They have taken on as the Continuum of Care lead. So that's the place to look for that information. So money from HUD comes down. It's based on your point in time count, the homeless point in time count that's done in the winter months. It's based on some census data. And it's also based on, the stronger regional coordination and activity that you have also helps bring those grants down. There are also other federal, we call them entitlement resources. I don't believe Bend is a recipient. There are federal home dollars, which help with housing for people exiting homelessness, as well as community development block grant funds. And it's based on population size if you're a direct recipient of that can sometimes be used for some of this. On top of that, we had state funding for what's called the Emergency Housing Account, and it's sub part of that State Homeless Assistance Program, EHA and CHAT, more acronyms. That funding has traditionally gone through the community action agencies, which is another layer. They are nonprofit organizations that were federally designated as anti-poverty organizations. They do cover statewide, however, many of them are multi-county. Many of those organizations were using that state emergency housing account money for prevention. They were using it for rent assistance, vouchers, helping people kind of stay in their homes, stay housed. Very few were actually providing shelter. What shelter we did see was largely focused kind of in the metro urban area and was, faith-based, what are known as high barrier shelters, and not always an option for a lot of folks. And then as we saw that numbers increase, we just were not equipped. Oregon has one of the highest rates of unsheltered homelessness in the country. We're leading with the West Coast, with our West Coast partners. In recent years, we've seen large inflections of state resources into this. There's been conversations about opening up the state's relationship so they can contract with more entities, and they've done that. The city of Bend had a direct contract. They owned the building for the navigation center. We had the Project Turnkey investments. More navigation centers funded. These are resource centers that aren't necessarily providing overnight shelter. Some have it co-located, but it's where you can group all of the resources that someone who is experiencing homelessness and needs to stabilize, whether it's healthcare, getting their social security cards, their veteran services if they qualify, behavioral health, job training, just a myriad of things that are needed for folks to stabilize and be successful and to get them connected to housing and the path for housing. So right now we've had basically a series of kind of emergency funds spit out. There was an influx of resources from the CARES Act and from ARPA, from the federal government, where cities and counties got direct funds, many of whom invested those directly back into shelter, expanded shelter. Bend was one. They're not alone. And now, that money's gone away, or it's going away. And so we've had this conversation with the state. We got $65 million just in this last short session to make sure shelters' doors don't close. We had the governor's executive order in 2023 and an influx of cash to expand more shelter. And then we said, hey, wait, you didn't fund the shelters that were already existing that the state maybe wasn't tracking. So that's the conversation we're having right now about what is the shelter system, what is the more permanent, predictable funding. We've got shelters that are inching along on 6-month contracts from the state. They're reporting 6 different ways to 6 different staff to serve the same people. And so we're really trying to bring some coherency and predictability to that system. And cities are having a hard time fighting to be heard. We're not seen as partners or stakeholders that the state should be working with, and we're working to change that. Bend is definitely a very leading voice on that. And we're being told that the conversation for 2025 is we need a more stable funding amount. What is the current service level? That's agency budget speak for the biennium 2-year amount that the state budgets on, that we need to be planning for, that communities can plan for, that shelters can plan for. That's all great, but on top of that, what about non-traditional shelter approaches, like safe parking sites, like the city of Eugene has Calistoga huts that aren't connected to power and water, but they have a community center with all of those amenities. How does HUD define shelter? What's eligible for what resources? How are communities currently paying for this? Can they continue? Who should or could be funding these things? That is the conversation we've been asking for. It hasn't happened yet, but it's definitely something that the league is working on. And also the recognition that the state cannot afford, the country cannot afford to put a shelter in every single city. We need to rely on regional coordination and understand that people experiencing homelessness don't recognize city boundaries, right? And so it's very difficult. That's a lot of the conversations that are happening right now. Yes.
Is the housing first model something that either at the state level, the House and the Senate talk about and support, or is it still just really very diverse in their opinions?
Yeah, great question about housing first. So that is the recognized national best practice that HUD prioritizes funding for and supports. That's what you see most cities doing. That's what you need to qualify for OHCS state funding as well. At the same time, you've probably seen politically that it doesn't work, that people, there should be requirements for people to get into shelter. And it's core of Housing First recognizes that people need stability to achieve their other goals, whether that's achieving sobriety, health outcomes, having a stable place to live while you search for work, recuperate, whatever it may be. And that's a really difficult area, and I think we've seen HUD kind of increase more education and outreach and kind of narrative about this, but it's something that is playing out locally and city and county governments as well.
What about at the state level? Is there, as a?
Yeah, the state supports housing first. That's part of the challenge too, when you've got cities who have set up more interim like campsites like those Calistoga huts that are cheaper. They get people off the street and into organized sites, get them connected to services, and also these are folks who would not go to a congregate indoor shelter potentially, right? So it's one tool, and right now the state is not wanting to fund those because they don't feel they are in line with Housing First, so it's difficult, right? And there are concerns about mass encampments and public safety issues with that for the shelter residents and things like that.
Feel free to wrap up, because I know you have another meeting.
Thank you. Yeah, I've got just maybe like 5 minutes more if
Okay.
anyone has anything else. Appreciate all the questions. Okay, go ahead.
This is probably something that we can take offline here, but, relative historical buildings, that have not been identified by owners as historical, like, let's say you have a building that's from the mid-1800s in your area, and, the owners are gonna develop it and build something, tear it down and build something completely different. Is there a way for the community to say, hey, we really like that restored? Is
I
there a
believe-
state agency?
Yeah, so the place you want to look to get an answer to that question, it actually lives at the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department. They have an office of state historic preservation, and they administer both the state resources around that, and they're your resource to learn about the federal historic registry and the overlay and how that works. So I would direct you there. They've got a good team there.
Thank you.
You bet.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and and please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to, pass along links and things like that if you have similar questions.
Do you work in Salem?